Thank you, Lane. Good morning, everyone. I will want to thank everyone. The theme of this panel is Cruising in Neutral. We have a great panel lined up to discuss transportation issues. The biographies of each of the panelists are already in the journal, so I'm going to make very brief introductions so that we have more time for your questions. On my left, Linda Bollinger is the National Management Consulting Director for HNTB Corporation. Next to her, Art Leahy, CEO of Los Angeles Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or Metro. And to his left, Martin Wax, Professor Emeritus for the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. I'm going to give each of the panelists a few minutes to make an opening statement to get things started. Then I have a few questions for the panelists, and then we will open it up for some questions from the audience. I will remind the speakers today to pass the mic between you and speak clearly into it. We are taping it, and it will be later viewed on YouTube by millions and millions of people. Let's start with LA traffic. Our Los Angeles roadways seem to only get more congested every year. With the Los Angeles population expected to double in the next 30 years, what are Metro's plans to prevent Angelenos from being perpetually stuck in traffic on the 101, 405, and 5 freeways, as we currently are?
Well, first of all, let me say good morning to everybody. At Metro, we have Measure R, voter-approved sales tax, and a variety of other resources to advance transportation projects. It's a great place to work because we get to advance highway projects as well as bus and rail projects. I'll also note that we're involved. We fund the Metrolink service, which is in LA County. We're involved with Amtrak, which is not obvious, but which is a critical part of the transportation issues that we all face. I like to say that we are revolutionizing the second biggest city in the country. You can do things today that were inconceivable a few years ago. For example, later on, you could take a train down to Exposition Park and see a Tyrannosaurus Rex and a mummy, and then you could, for example, go into, let's say, the Coliseum and watch, for example, SC beat UCLA. And then next year, you could take a train to Pasadena and have lunch on Colorado Boulevard, and then you could, for example, go to, well, let's say the Rose Bowl and watch USC beat UCLA. It's an all-purpose transit system. Now, my partner to my left is liable to contradict what I've just said. I'll just point this out. SC just fired the coach because he only won 65% of his games. If he was at UCLA, they would have given him an extension and put up a statue to him. You know, in the San Fernando Valley, we're working on a variety of things. The Orange Line got extended a year or so ago. We're working on improving and coordinating Amtrak and Metrolink service from the north into downtown LA. That relieves the 5 and the Hollywood Freeway and the Ventura Freeway. Right now, during rush hour, those trains coming from Orange County and from the north relieve about 1 lane on the I-5 during rush hour. We need to improve that service to relieve pressure on those freeways. In addition to that, we're working to improve the I-5 all the way up to Palmdale and a variety of other things. We are talking to the High-Speed Rail Authority. It's hard to see what will happen with that project, but if it does, we want to make sure that it coordinates with Burbank Airport into downtown LA and Union Station. So, you know, I know that we face what sometimes feels like it is an unyielding problem because demand keeps climbing. You know, our resources are limited. 20, 30, 40 years ago, the Federals paid 80%, 90% sometimes of transportation projects. Now in LA, it's about 12 to 15%. So we're struggling to address a set of issues with reducing resources. And so with that, I'll conclude. We're going to continue to improve the bus system. We're going to continue to improve our rail lines today. We're carrying about 400,000 people a day on rail. That number is growing. We're going to be improving service to into North Hollywood from downtown Los Angeles. I should also mention before I stop at this point, we are just now beginning with the approval of the Board of Directors to look at a Sepulveda Pass project. You've all been on the 405. That'll be done in about a year. But we want to look at a tunnel under the Sepulveda Pass that would run from around Van Nuys down to Westwood. So then people who live in the valley could take a train down there and watch SC beat UCLA in basketball. But that project could be very interesting. We're considering a toll project with toll lanes between those 2 points, also with a rail transit line. We're in the very early stages of evaluating whether that might be feasible or not. I don't know yet, but I'm pleased that the board has given us an opportunity to study that. So with that, I'll conclude for the current time being.
Thank you, Art. Martin, what can our area's transportation planners learn from other parts of the country and the world?
That's a wide open question, and I'll just mention 2 or 3 points. First of all, I would think that we have a lot to learn from Europe and Asia because things are different there. We don't have, I don't think we benefit by imitating directly what they've done because their context is different, their situation is different. But we can observe what's happened there and see differences and use that as information on the basis of which to do better plans for our region. So, for example, there has been congestion pricing in Singapore for 50 years, and Singapore looks quite different than it did before. There's much more use of transit, there's much less congestion in the core, and there's much more development just outside the core that includes a lot of parking where people transfer to public transit and go into the core. It doesn't mean we're going to do exactly the same thing as Singapore, but it does suggest that the use of prices is an important policy lever. We might want to use them in a different way than they do in Singapore. In Europe, we see higher gas taxes everywhere, and we can observe the effect of that. People do use transit more, and people do buy smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles. Europe still is decentralizing and sprawling, much as the U.S. did 50 and 60 years ago. I'm not sure that we would adopt either what exactly has happened in Singapore nor in Europe, but that's good information. And so when I translate what I see abroad and apply it to the U.S., I think, for example, that Los Angeles and Arts Organization is studying expanding our hot lanes network, which is, I think, a better application of pricing to our region than cordon or area pricing, where you have to pay more, to go into the center of an area. Our area is more dispersed, and our congestion is more on the freeways and not on the central city streets. So we are exploring, and his agency has just implemented 2 hot lanes on the 110 and the 10. And I see more of that coming in the future. And people say, well, why should I pay a toll when I've already been using that road for free and our taxes have already paid for it? Think also, though, it's not just about revenue, it's about influencing the choices that people make and controlling the flow. If you can get a guaranteed ride at 45 or 50 miles an hour by paying for it, that's only an extra choice. It's an additional option that you have, as opposed to just staying in the congested road. If you don't want to pay, stay in the congested road. What this innovation is giving us is more choices, more options, and we need the revenue to continue to improve the system. And the vast majority of the federal support for some of these projects has been used to put in buses which serve the lower income people who have fewer economic choices. So in general, I think these are moving us in the right direction. And what we're doing is using insights from Europe and Asia, but not imitating their projects. Just 2 quick additional points. Technology is central to being able to do this, the use of transponders. And technology is changing so rapidly with things like Uber and other forms of ride sharing, car sharing, and so on. And I think that we should incorporate planning with advanced technology to manage our traffic in Los Angeles. And the last thing I think is that I'd mention is the great importance of the involvement of the private sector. When the Sepulveda Pass potential project was mentioned, undoubtedly there will be an important private investment of capital in that, because we're so short of resources, and there are places where investing private capital can yield acceptable returns in comparison with other investments, and at the same time improve our infrastructure.
Thank you, Martin. Linda, transportation projects seem to always be estimated in billions of dollars. That's billions with a B. Why do improvements cost so much? And what is the private sector doing to more efficiently utilize limited dollars?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me to participate. And I just want to say that I've got a lot in common with this panel before I answer the question. I used to work at Metro and went to SC, so I have that in common with Art. But I did go to the UC System undergrad, so I have that in common with Marty Wax. And if Andre Boutros was here, I used to work for the California Transportation Commission as their deputy for transit, so I have that in common with him. But really, in answer to your question, I'm representing the private kind of A&E sector today. However, it's a joint effort to reduce costs, both public and private. And I've been involved in two studies at the Transportation Research Board, and I wanted to highlight some of their findings, and they speak directly to this issue. One is, why do projects' capital costs cost too much? And secondly, why do their soft costs get escalated and cost too much? And I can provide references if you'd like, if anyone's interested in those studies. But on soft costs are just everything except kind of like the final design construction. And engineers usually estimate them at 20%, but practice shows that they're estimated more at 24 to 40% in actuality. So that's a cost driver right there. So learning how we developed a guidebook, or I was on a panel that reviewed consultant developing a guidebook for how do you estimate the non-construction type of costs, so you're more accurate in your cost estimates. But on the capital cost increase, that study was very controversial because it not only talked about what are the drivers for cost increases and what you can do about them, but gave like a half a dozen case studies. And they had 5 hypotheses. One is projects go up because project sponsors minimize costs at the planning phase in order for the project to be more attractive to the funding agency. Now, you've never heard that, right? Number 2, at the early phases, many project elements are excluded or not known at the time of preliminary engineering, and sometimes there's unrealistically low unit cost estimates. As you know, things like steel and concrete and others have been escalating in costs, and sometimes those aren't realistically estimated. Number 3 hypothesis is that project costs are increased at the final design and construction phase because of, well, euphemistically, enhancements to the project. We call it scope creep. The 4th hypothesis is that project costs are increased at construction because it's taken so long to do the project development phase with all the oversight and the environmental document that there's been a lot of schedule delays, and it's just pure inflationary increase. And the final hypothesis is that projects with a high degree of complexities, tunnels, structures, underground stations, utility relocations, those tend to go up once you know those actual costs at the point of construction. So the study was interesting, and it really took each of those hypotheses, looked at each case study and said, okay, what was the difference between the engineer's bid and the actual construction bid? How many scope changes do they have? How many schedule changes? How many community demands and political issues were there that created that sometimes scope creep? And finally, did they have an adequate amount of contingencies at each phase of the project? So just some suggestions I'd like to throw out there, and that the study and several of us in the industry have talked about. The first and foremost, there should be a transparent project development process with a lot of stakeholder outreach and input. Second, you have to select the right delivery process. There's a lot of alternative delivery options, but know the risks between the public and the private sector. Third is there has to be a good organization and good staff that are dedicated to the project. Fourth, improve cost estimation. There's a lot of guidance out there, and a lot of the professional engineers are really paying more attention to accurate cost estimates. Fifth is project management techniques. How do you control budget and schedule, and how do you track and control scope creep? And then several other items like claims management, quality assurance, risk management is a big issue. And finally, can we improve funding mechanisms to promote flexibility so we can speed up project delivery? So those are some of my introductory remarks.
Thank you, Linda. Now we'll open it up to the public here, and I think we have some people who have some microphones in the back to help out, or are we just going to repeat the questions? Okay, I guess I'm going to repeat the question. I'm going to start with you in the back.
I have a question. Have any of you, and you somewhat alluded to it in your presentation, given any thought to any kind of creative way that we can blow up the block in terms of our LA culture? I happen to drive there myself.
So we're looking at what are the creative ways that these people can talk about how we solve problems with everybody driving themselves to a place versus other means of sharing the road.
I would start by saying that I don't accept the premise that there is a cultural difference. I think Los Angeles grew to maturity as a city after there was a well-developed transit system and after the automobile had been invented. Many cities with which we associate high density and walking and so on existed before the invention of public transit and the automobile, and the portions of those cities which grew up in the 20th century look a lot like Los Angeles, including places like New York and London and Paris, but they're outskirts. So we are a product of our history more than our culture. And I think Angelenos are as ready to use public transit, bicycles, and other modes of transportation beside the automobile as is anyone else. The difference is that we are behind the curve in getting the options, the alternative, the supply, and that's what Arts Agency is doing. No city in the world has developed public transit in the last 20 or 30 years as much as LA has. So we're playing catch up. But I don't think it's an attitude problem. I think it's part of our history and the systems that we have.
I'd like to add what Mr. Wax has just said. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I remember back into the 80s when we were discussing this place, people would say, it's not New York, it's not Chicago, we don't need those things. You know, the city was shaped, I agree 100% with the history that was just given, but much of the expansion occurred during an era of cheap land and cheap gasoline. In the 50s and 60s, nobody imagined 10 million people in LA and still growing. Today, no one says we're not New York and we're not Chicago. It changed maybe in the 80s, maybe around the time of the Olympics. We all accept the premise it's a big city now, and we all accept the idea that we have to confront some of the issues of big cities. And you know, we do have the most rapid expansion of transit in the nation right now. When I'm at transit meetings, I tell people, you should come to work in LA. We have the biggest program in the country. We have the Hollywood sign. We have beaches and mountains. This is a big place. As you travel around the county, and even other counties, you see changes in urban form occurring that we didn't cause, but we supported. You go around downtown Los Angeles, it's 2nd and Alameda. If you go out there tonight, you'll see people walking with a baby carriage at 2nd and Alameda after dark, walking a dog. That's inconceivable. There's changes on Ventura Boulevard and Van Nuys and Santa Monica and Pasadena, and they all have to do with the same thing. This change in attitude, which I believe has occurred, as well as the fact that people are getting tired of getting stuck in traffic. I have a son who's an attorney, and he lives in Highland Park because he doesn't want to drive an hour and a half every day in from the Inland Empire. He says that's a smart thing to do. By the way, I take the train to work every day, and 4 times out of 5 I have to stand up because the train from Pasadena is too crowded. So I think things are changing. I do want to just make one comment about what Martin was talking about congestion pricing. It does work. The SR-91 in Orange County was purchased by the OCTA when I was there. They put in an aggressive congestion pricing policy. As a consequence of that, the toll lanes, the 2 toll lanes, carry more people than the 5 parallel free lanes, which are congested. It works every day of the year out there. By the way, if you haven't seen the SR-91, you ought to go out and look at it. Our congestion pricing project here has gone much better than I thought it would. It's been a smooth implementation. It's working. People are using it. And we're beginning now to see improvements in the parallel free lanes because of the higher speeds on the toll or the congestion pricing lanes. Thank you.
Well, I can appreciate how LA has changed. I'm a fourth generation Angelino. My great-grandparents moved here in the 1850s after the gold rush. So and also having worked here as early as the 70s downtown LA, I've really seen the change for the better. But it's all about motivation and supply. I took the train today from Orange County. My motivation is it would have taken me much longer by car. And supply is what ART's doing, making transit an option, both bus and rail and BRT. We finally have more options to get around. I can now take Orange County Metrolink to Union Station and then up to Burbank Airport, and I'll reverse the trip. So you have much more options now than you did before. So that's changing LA, and I've seen a major change in the last decades.
Thank you. Good.
I have two questions. One, are there any plans to do anything with the gridlock that occurs from Santa Monica to the 405 in the evening? And my second question is, I was on the 405 in the traffic and with all the congestion going on, and I recognize that all projects are financially driven, but it surprised me that some kind of structural columns were not put down the middle of the 405 to eventually put in a transportation system and while the disruption is going on.
Okay, just to for the YouTube video, the question revolves around what can be done with the traffic from Santa Monica moving east towards the 405 in the evening, and also why during the current construction on the 405 wasn't there some thought process to future transit options along that corridor?
There was some structural columns,
Yeah. Great.
Well, first of all, in terms of the current gridlock, and I agree it's real tough out there. We are building the exposition line that goes to Santa Monica. If you haven't ridden it, I would really recommend that you do it, especially on a nice day when it's clear. It's a really nice ride. Goes right by one of the world's great universities, right across the street from Exposition Park. We are hoping to get a grant from the federal government to extend the subway out to La Cienega and ultimately out to UCLA and the Veterans Hospital. That subway is going to be very successful. By the way, the Blue Line today is carrying 90,000 people, one of the busiest light rail lines in the nation. As regards to the 405 in general, on any freeway widening, and including attempts to build elevated freeways, there's generally a great deal of community hostility. People don't like that because of the intrusion into the neighborhood. Trying to widen a freeway is really tough because of community opposition, which you know what happened if we were trying to widen the Ventura. I think that the Sepulveda Pass project I mentioned is what we think is the best idea to try to get something going. There's $1 billion for that corridor in the third decade. If this project works, what we hope to do is to free up that billion, if it works as a public-private partnership, what we'd hope to do is to free up that $1 billion to do other things on that corridor as well.
I'd like to suggest that the assumption that increased capacity in the 405 corridor will address the congestion in the 405 corridor. I think that's not correct. If you look at the origins and destinations of those traveling on the 405, most people are not coming from immediately adjacent to the 405 and going to a place immediately adjacent to the 405. So adding more capacity right along that right-of-way, it would only funnel more trips from people's origins and destinations into an already congested corridor. And what public transit does, what ART System does, is it provides a grid of service to take people from where they are to where they want to go. And often that's not along the corridor of the most congestion. The reason people are on the 405 is that there's a freeway there, not because they're going from one entrance to one exit. And so putting more capacity in that corridor may look like the right thing to do when you're traveling on that corridor, but it's actually smarter and more cost-effective to put in more capacity from where people are going from to the places that they're going to.
Great. Well, you guys were talking about people having other options. The two of you took transit this morning. I drove my plug-in hybrid here this morning. But as a result of that, I've been buying significantly less gas. So without me and others who are moving this direction, buying less and less gas, we're seeing a reduction in our gas tax coffers. What do we do moving forward to supplant that revenue stream?
Well, we certainly have to find an alternative way for future revenues for transportation. The gas tax is a flat tax, but no one politically has had the stomach to increase that tax, nor really venture out on any other alternative tax. We've been nipping on the edges. We've been using our facilities more efficiently, like ART's express lanes. Creating revenue out of existing assets is really the first step, because we do have a lot of assets in the express lanes, and incentivizing people to either pay or carpool is a good idea. But I also did a study for the Southern California Associated Governments on congestion pricing, and we looked at three basic areas. One was express lanes, and eventually to have express lanes at every single HOV lane in LA, well, actually in Southern California, would be an express lane for both HOVs and single occupants that would pay. The second option was to do a mileage-based user fee, which the feds have been talking about, but kind of put on the back burner. Oregon is doing pilot tests where you would get charged by the number of miles you drove, not by the number of gallons you needed in your car. And the third idea was cordon pricing, which is what London is doing. And that's where it's really an electronic cordon. We looked at downtown LA, LAX. We even looked preliminary at the Valley, where you have transit options or where you're going to have transit options, West LA with Subway to the Sea, and incentivize people to take transit or change their commute patterns so the charge would be highest during the peak hours to get into downtown LA, let's say. Off-peak, it would be much cheaper. So those are ways to use pricing as an incentive to not only raise money, but to change travel behavior.
Yeah, it's a serious problem that we're not dealing with. Revenues are dropping and demand on the system is increasing. But we don't want to raise taxes. We don't want to pay for it. So we have to confront, as adults, what are we going to do about this? Revenues are dropping and demand is increasing. What we're looking at increasingly is public-private partnerships. We think that the potential project in Pasadena might be very impactful, public passage I've mentioned, and other things. I do want to say I think there's a hard part of that for the board of directors, for any public policy board. If we're going to try to get a public-private partnership on a toll facility, the franchise entity is going to want to control the tolls. Otherwise, their revenue is uncertain. I think that's going to be a little difficult for the Metro Board or other boards to accept. If you're going to ask somebody to come in and invest $1 billion or whatever the amount might be, they're going to want to do a traffic and revenue study, figure out what demand would be and what revenue would be, and they're going to want to be able to control those tolls based on trying to find where do I maximize demand and revenue. If the public agency wants to control how they set tolls, that's going to transfer risk to them, and it's going to reduce their willingness to make the investment. So there's some awkward issues there as well.
I would add to this discussion, I agree with everything that was said before, but I would add one more dimension. I think that there is an assumption that the public is not supportive of increased taxes and fees to improve the transportation system. But polls show and actual elections show that people vote overwhelmingly in favor of fees when they know what they'll be used for. So in California, I think it's now 28 counties have passed local sales tax just for transportation, and we in LA County have done it 3 times, including when the requirement is 2/3 of the vote, which is a very tough thing to do in any election. So somehow people in Washington think that they can't raise taxes and fees, but the public is telling us something quite different. Don't raise taxes and fees without, tying it to a purpose and an end product. But if you do that wisely, people will vote in favor of additional taxes and fees for transportation.
Great. More questions? Fernando Guerra.
Thanks, Jeff. Great conversation so far. Professor Wax, you mentioned in your opening remarks private-public partnerships, and Mr. Leahy just mentioned it as well. So a question about that, and number one is how would that work? My assumption is that private equity to invest in infrastructure would want returns of 8 at minimum, usually 13%, number one. Number two, where we tried it, Orange County Toll Road, has been a disaster from the returns perspective, not the building of the projects, et cetera, but everybody who first invested, they're all out. And then third, I would make the following statement. I was at a conference about infrastructure about 2 months ago with a variety of different foreign investors, mostly Australians and Canadians, and they all lamented the fact that private-public partnership goes throughout the world except in America. My response to that is that I believe it actually works better in America than anywhere else. It's called the tax-exempt market. The private sector, private people have lent MTA billions of dollars through that, but only expecting returns of 3, 4, 5%, depending on the year. And so I would ask, what's wrong with it continuing to use the tax-exempt market instead of public-private partnerships where you give up control and pay 3 or 4 times as much?
Great. Lengthy three-part question, so I will try quickly to summarize. Some discussion of why public-private partnerships, how they could work, what different models they are, how do we reach the return on investment for those investors, which are high, and three, is the current system truly a public-private partnership with private lending?
First of all, let me just say, the comment about the Orange County toll roads is 2/3 correct, but 1/3 wrong. The 2 TCA projects, you're correct. The 91 was purchased in the open market by OCTA, and the price was set based on a joint projection of revenues discounted back to present value. Under public ownership, the congestion pricing model was applied more aggressively than it was otherwise by the private guy. Moreover, when it was privately operated, the folks who were stuck in traffic, they had a non-compete clause in the contract, the franchise, such that Caltrans could not draw a map on a napkin to improve the SR 91. So we had hundreds of thousands of people who were furious at the private company, which was profiting based on their misery. When OCTA took over, we actually invested some money in Riverside County, so we dissipated that anger. Now Riverside is extending those toll facilities to the 15. Under public ownership, because we could be more aggressive, revenues went up, speeds went up, and volumes went up. That's a...
And rates of return was 17%.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry?
But that was then by public ownership, it was purchased through tax-exempt.
Well, fair enough, but I'm referring to what's happened to the road. It's not a disaster at all. It's a great success.
I didn't mean the actual road being a disaster. I meant the financing. Okay, in terms of there's constant points about let's use public-private partnerships to finance the projects. It doesn't work.
My biggest lamentation about that road is I don't own 1% of it.
The SR 91 was returning 17% on investment, which was the maximum allowed by state legislation at the time of the sale. So, and I think the biggest investors in it were the Ontario Canada Teachers Retirement Pension, and they were getting 17% on their investment. So, I mean, this is very complex and subtle. Not every project is the same. And it's important to note that the Orange County toll roads were doing poorly in a downturn that was economy-wide, and the private sector was doing poorly in many sectors, and many businesses were experiencing financial stress. The Orange County toll roads were predicated upon growth in development in those areas, which didn't occur because of the economic downturn. And I'm hopeful that when we look back on it from 20 years from now, those roads, there has been a restructuring of the debt. Those roads will have proven to be useful as part of our transportation system infrastructure. But I'm not suggesting that every public-private partnership will be a success. Everyone won't. No particular business investment is without risk, and these are as well. And I think we've learned a lot from the last 20 years of experience to word the contracts in a much more felicitous manner so that the public sector gets value for money.
And I can add that P3s have changed over the years. My firm, HNTB, does a lot of P3s, mainly for the owner side, some contractors in Texas, Florida, East Coast, and I've worked on them personally as well. And what's changed is there's more control now from the public sector and there's more education. But it still boils down to, if you had all the money in the world as a public agency, you don't need private investment. But if you want to leverage your dollars and use the private balance sheet, as it were, then it's worth exploring it. But I think the public agencies are now more educated on the risk transfer. You know, what are they going to get? What does the private sector get? What's the benefit to the public agency? In the end, the public owns the facility. But what's changed in a lot of one, like the Miami Tunnel Project and others, is what's called availability payments. It used to be like Texas would turn, or Indiana would turn the turnpike or the road over to the private sector to collect the tolls and collect the profits. Now the public agency oftentimes collects the tolls and gives them back to the private sector based on the agreement, but only based on performance. So it's only if the road or the facility is available for public use and in good maintenance state will they get their payment. And that gives the public agency a little more control on, because they're concerned about the public. The private sector, to use it extreme, is more concerned about the profits. So it's an educational process, and you have to go in with your eyes wide open. The staff at the agency have to be robust and understand the implications, and you have to understand short-term versus long-term gains from that option.
Okay. Councilmember Fred Gaines.
At risk that my question opens up the ability for the CEO to continue with his seemingly psychotic allegiance to
Athletic programs, yes.
I do want to ask you a question about the Valley. NICA, and I think most Valley residents will tell you they're deep-seated, and I think factually based belief that the Valley does not do very well, get anywhere near its correct or fair share of transportation programs. They voted for taxes to pay for rail lines. They got bus lines, one bus line, which is good. Although by saving the money, you should have had 3 or 4 bus lines. And even in the more updated programs, it seems light what the Valley is getting. And so I would like to hear what the future programs are for the Valley and why Valley residents and Valley businesses should not have this feeling that they do, that they are not getting their fair share of
Great. And just for, once again, repetition of the question, why is the Valley not getting its fair share of revenue coming back to the Valley when they have voted for these tax increases to support transit and freeway improvements?
It's interesting working for Metro. As I travel around LA County, no matter where I go, I'm informed that that sector was shorted. Metro accomplished something which is quite remarkable. We got a 2/3 yes vote on a sales tax, which screws everybody. That's an astonishing accomplishment. And by the way, I say to people from different sectors, but I'm not joking, South Bay, east side of the county, the San Gabriel Valley, up north, the west side, everybody gets shorted. So I will say to them, let's reflect on what we do in Sacramento and Washington. If you think going back there and having a fist fight in front of them is the road to success, let's do that. But if we think we ought to have an aggressive program, maybe we ought to work together. But let's just talk about the Valley. Let's see. Oh yeah, we have the subway there, little project, a few $billion that we're improving. I-5 is under construction now. You may have been caught in the congestion. The 405, $1.5 billion project under construction. Amtrak services, Metrolink services that we pay for, the high-speed rail project coming down through the valley with a stop at Burbank Airport. There's a lot going on in the San Fernando Valley. By the way, there's a lot going on all over the county. This is the biggest, most aggressive highway and transit program in the nation. I know there's some discussion about converting the Orange Line to a rail project. You know, easier said than done. We have to shut the Orange Line down for 4 or 5 years while we build a rail line. But there's a lot going on out here, and that's going to continue in the future. We're looking at a corridor, north-south corridor on Van Nuys Boulevard. So, you know, a lot going on.
Other questions? Okay, then I will take one from myself. Oh, sure.
Linda, in your opening remarks, you talked about how construction costs are changing, and as we, for all the different reasons that you cited. And one you said was community pressures, I think is what you called it. Specifically, I'm thinking about our desire to use small and DBE firms, as well as to have targeted hiring through project labor agreements. Did your study show that those are efforts to create jobs and to spread the work around to a lot of businesses also causes project costs to increase?
So just quickly, the question was, do some of the programs that have been instituted by public agencies to create local jobs and workforce within the local community actually increasing the cost of projects?
You know, the study didn't specifically look at DBEs or labor agreements as implementing it, because I think that DBEs have been around for a while, but labor agreements probably are fairly new, at least in this area. But they did say, like, change orders and schedule were not the major drivers. It was more the development processes where the study said you need to take more time to have more stakeholder input, which includes everyone, and also have that throughout the process and better define the project up front is where the really impacts happened, not once you get into construction. But having said that, one thing we're doing in the private, at least H&DB is doing, I know a lot of other firms may be doing as well, is having a mentoring and training program for our DBEs so that when we bring them on, and yes, it's a federal requirement, an agency requirement, but we want to have good DBEs. We also want to support the goal of changing DBEs into primes. So to do that, they can learn from a firm like ours, which is a national engineering, architecture, and planning firm, and we have to be responsible for their training and their delivery of their work products. So that's something we're doing. And also for the first time ever in the last, I guess I'd say, a couple of years, even 5 years, having more alliances with the labor community. We never used to do that. The A&Es never used to touch labor, but now it's in our interest to work with labor because that affects projects too and the delivery.
So we talked a little bit about taxation and trying to have an adult discussion that, more revenue is needed. Are there any other ideas to reduce costs on the other side of the ledger, or other ways that we can reduce the potential impact to taxpayers?
Go ahead.
The concept of mileage-based user fees was introduced, and I would imagine that if you considered it from scratch, if someone just mentioned it, you'd be pretty skeptical right at the beginning. What happens with a mileage-based user fee is that every time you drive, there's some meter or device in your vehicle or maybe on your smartphone that's keeping track of your travel, and it's charging you on the basis of per mile traveled. And you say, well, why would first of all, it would intrude into my privacy, and if somebody's tracking me, government can know where I went. And secondly, you say, well, I've already been paying gas taxes for decades, and why would I want this? And it's a big barrier that we have to get over to move to a new way of doing business. But I actually found in the transcripts of hearings When we adopted the gasoline tax, it was debated between 1918 when Oregon adopted it and 1922 when California adopted it. What we did was we wanted to charge tolls, but the gas tax was more efficient because you didn't have to put a toll collector in a toll booth everywhere you went. And there was actually testimony in 1920 that said, if we can find some way of charging more directly for the use of the road, we should abandon the gas tax when that happens. Well, now it's happening, and we forget that it's not a new tax on top of something, it's a new way of charging people. And that way of charging people will both make travel more efficient and raise more revenue. If we recognize that the amount of travel that we're doing is growing much, much faster than our gasoline consumption, just the change, keeping it revenue neutral, keeping the tax equal to the gasoline tax, would raise 20% more revenue in 15 years. We've calculated that out at the RAND Corporation, and it would be fairer because people would be charged for their actual use of the system. And the importance of the Oregon experiment, which was just mentioned, is that we learned that people become more favorable as they become more familiar. So 85% of the population opposed the SR 91, people living in that corridor, before it was opened. And 1 year later, 75% said it was a good idea. And I think mileage-based user fees is going to look like that. It's going to take 25 years. I mean, I understand that we need to do other things in the short term, and it's going to take a long time to fully transition. But I think ultimately we'll see that it's both faster and more, fairer, I meant to say, and more lucrative. And it is the next generation of transportation finance. It's just so painful to transition from one generation to another.
Let me cry for a minute about how hard it is to get projects going. In California, you can get an environmental exemption for a football stadium or a basketball arena, but not for a rail project. We were facing delays in Monrovia because of the owner of the land where we're going to put the yard raised a series of environmental objections. We ended up paying $20 million more than we should have for that land, but had we not done that, we would have faced years of delay. I think sometimes those issues are abused, environmental issues. You know, it's really a tragedy. We're emerging from a period of 4 or 5 years of low construction cost. And we didn't get much out in contract because of the regulations. It takes years to get a project going. So we are now entering a period of rapidly climbing construction cost. Measure R passed 4.5 years ago. We missed out on great opportunities that we cannot recapture. A little more crying. The state and the feds don't have much money these days. But you know what they do have? They have plenty of rules. And as they lose their ability to impact projects through funding, I think there's an impulse to increase their impact through more rulemaking. You know, I'll give you an example on the Crenshaw project. It's basically locally funded, but there's a loan, a federal loan on it, which we're going to pay back. As a consequence, all the federal rules apply. One of those rules prevents or prohibits local preference in hiring. So I got to Inglewood and talked with the mayor, and he says, we're going to have local hiring, right, on the Crenshaw project. And I go, well, no, I can't do that because of federal rules. So he says, oh, I see. So my people can put up with congestion from construction. My people can put up with dust and delay. In fact, my people are good enough to pay the taxes, but they aren't good enough to get a job. You can imagine that's an awkward conversation to have. So, you know, it used to be the feds paid 80 or 90%, so the rules were fine. Now they pay 15 or 12%. The rules still apply. By the way, this gets crazy. I have members of Congress who call me and ask me for money. Is that the way we...
We're very limited on the amount of design builds we can do per state legislation, so we have to have special legislation for that for each one. But we're trying more options with our clients. Clients are choosing to speed up the time between the design and construction. So, for example, design build, you hire the contractor who comes with it, the designer, so you don't have two separate procurements. That could save you probably 18 months to 2 years. CMGC, where you hire the designer separately, but you also hire the contractor at the same time, kind of force them to work together. It's not exactly like design build, but it's a little more flexible regulation-wise. City of LA is using that on the 6th Street Bridge, which we're designing. So they hired us a couple months ago. They just hired the contractor, and now we'll see some not only advantages of the contractor being on early for constructability reviews, but also a time savings when you go into that construction phase. On the user side, we did a lot of public not only surveys, but forums where we had an outreach person bring in a random group of folks to talk about congestion pricing. And I remember one woman in Orange County saying that she hates the 91 freeway, she hates pricing, but she takes it every day. Why? Because if she didn't, she wouldn't have a life at home. So once you get used to it, yeah, you don't like it, but it's part of speeding up your trip to and from work or to and from your activities so you can have a life and enjoy the quality life in Southern California.
Yes, Francine.
We've been focusing a lot on pricing for the automobile, but we're not focusing, I know this is pocket change in comparison, but there are 1.5 million people every day getting on public transit in LA County who are paying probably the least amount for that privilege of any place I've ever traveled to. I just got back from Chicago, base fare is $235 or $250. Toronto says if you're going to get on the mass transit, you are the people who should pay for it. To you, so it's more important to you to go take that bus ride, so be it. But Los Angeles seems to have an incredibly low fare box recovery. Is there any movement to increase that so they can pay their fair share?
So the question is there any discussion of increasing fare prices to ride transit in LA County?
This is a real tough issue for the Board of Directors. We've done some work looking at transit systems in Europe, Asia, South America, and North America. Of those major cities, you can guess who they are: Mexico City and Tokyo and Madrid and so on, London, New York. Of the big cities in those continents, LA has about, I think we have the second lowest fare per boarding. The only one lower is Mexico City. We have the lowest percent of cost borne by the user. Of 20 cities small around the world, the average fare per boarding is around 66, 67%. The users are paying around 26% of the cost. I've told the board that this is not sustainable. It's just not sustainable. The good thing is we don't have to get up to 50% like some of the Eastern folks are, but we do have to get to 35 or 33%, something like that. When we raise this issue, by the way, our fare system, this is easy for me to say because I wasn't here when we made the current fare system. We're going to recommend changes starting in October. The fare system, the route structure assumes transfers, but we don't give a transfer, so therefore you have to pay twice if you transfer. So we assume transfers, but we discourage transfers. Moreover, about 40% of the people who board the system every day have a discount: senior citizens, students, and other categories. So it's just not sustainable. We're going to go to the board next month, and we're going to criticize the current fare system. We're going to talk about the need to raise the revenue per boarding over the next 4 or 5 years in order to be sustainable. We must do this. If we do not do this, we will begin to confront the need to curtail the capital program, both highways and transit. That's a fact. We've begun to tell members this is going to be a real hard issue for the board, but we're going to let you know, when we go to the board, I always attempt to base the recommendations on the business case. They don't have to buy the business case. They don't have to agree with what we're recommending, but we're going to confront what the economic outlook is, and it's not good. We're balanced. I've been here 4 years. We have 4 balanced budgets. By the way, we had, when I arrived, $1.5 billion of deferred maintenance. That's terrible. We went to the board last year and got, this is my attempt to manage from the grave. We got the board to pass a policy which requires a CEO to maintain facilities and rolling stock cars, buses, and trains to the manufacturer's suggested standard. We must do this rather than succumb to short-term pressure for press events or whatever it might be. We're going to lay out the facts, and by the way, in October, what I hope to do is to give the board a ton of information, a ton of data. We want to give them several months that they can look at it so they can slice it and dice it and figure out why it's not really a problem. If they figure out how to do it without raising the fares, that's a wonderful thing. We can't find that solution. The fares are low on a worldwide basis, and they are not sustainable. Add to that, we have, on policy, we have amongst the lowest load ratio. The load ratio is the ratio of passengers to seats. We're lower than any big city around the world by a long shot. So we have low fares and we have low passenger loads. Those are both policy decisions, and they put us into a position where beginning in about 18 months we're going to go into the red, and we're not going to go a little bit into the red. We're going to go deep into the red if we don't confront this problem.
There's a question embedded in Art's answer. As a citizen, what kind of pricing would you prefer? Would you prefer that the system, that prices be based upon the cost of offering a particular service? If so, the rail fares would have to be much higher than the bus fares. And if we try to cross-subsidize, if we take some of the revenue from the bus system and use it to expand the capital investments in rail, there will be lawsuits from organizations like the Bus Riders Union who feel that's discriminatory. So, I mean, ultimately, the question of fares is a political question. I personally would favor fares which vary with time of day, that vary with distance traveled. The people who ride at the peak hour are the richest, and they tend to go the longest distances. So one or the other, either charging by time of day or by distance traveled, would be an innovation. There would be more opposition than support. You're sitting next to Rini Berlin. We worked on distance-based and time-of-day fares, I think it was 1980 and 81, and we spoke to the board, and they said, this is interesting, we'll study it. If you talk to the board today, they'll say, this is interesting, we'll study it, but it's politically very explosive. They're doing that all over the world, and I think we have the capacity technologically, with our fare card systems, to have very differentiated fares, which would reflect the cost of offering a service, or the social benefit of a service, or the congestion level on the service, but it's going to be politically very challenging to adopt that.
I appreciate the comments, and we will talk with the board about peak fares for the reasons just outlined. While I have not liked peak fares in the past, this is a bus operator's wristwatch, railroad approved, by the way, is required for bus operator rules. If it is my wristwatch which determines when it's 4 o'clock, for example, so some guy gets on the bus and I say the fare's gone up because it's 4:01 p.m. and he goes, no, it's not, it's 3:59. We've embedded in the fare structure disputes. Now, with the TAP system, the fare card system, we can rely upon the clock in the computer. So I think we should look at peak fares, and I think that helps combat part of the argument of the Bus Riders Union, because if you are a low-income person, you can move your ride outside of the peak. By the way, that's exactly what motorists do on the SR91. The peak got wider with congestion pricing because people manage the system against whatever the rules of the system are. The fare system that we have today is very counterproductive, and I'll give you an example. If I get on a bus in Westwood after the SC Victory, and I want to go downtown, I get to Western, where the subway is. Now, the subway's faster. So what I should do is get off the bus at Western, or in a few years at La Cienega, transfer to the subway and go downtown. I'll save some time. Except today I have to pay another fare. So if I'm a low-income rider, I'm going to stay on the bus. What this does is it confounds our efforts to capture the capacity available on the subway, which is there. There's very high fixed cost on the subway. But what it also does is artificially increase or maintain higher demand on the bus, which therefore results in higher cost on the bus system. Our fare system is counterproductive to our objectives of trying to have an integrated transit system. Thanks.
So one of the comments that a lot of people make as to why they don't take public transit is that last mile. Especially if you're off-peak, you can take a train to someplace, get there, and then have another mile or mile and a half to go and be forced to walk that because of the schedules of the other buses or missing local circulators. How do we fix that last mile, and are these ride shares or now TNCs a potential jitney solution?
I think there are two issues there. One is information. One is, you walk to the bus stop and you wait 20 minutes, but with new technology, we have on our smartphones, and even low-income people are getting smartphones, the ability to know when the next bus is coming with some accuracy, and therefore to use our time more efficiently. So the first mile, at least, is more manageable than it used to be. And I believe that that's an important element in the increased interest in and support for public transit among the citizens. But at the other end, there's also, of course, to the extent that we increase service on the street, we're lessening the distance to ultimate destination. But in addition, we have all sorts of new options with bicycle use and short-term car rental and shuttles to employment sites that are complementing the basic transit system. And it's in these areas that I think the most opportunity for increasing ridership exists, both through providing information and through providing options for access at both ends of the trip. But it's happening very dramatically right now.
I could add that the federal government, in collapsing a lot of the funding categories, created one called Transportation Alternatives, which stresses more the walking, the pedestrian, the bikeways, et cetera, and improving the streetscape. And SCAG actually has a new policy on active transportation, the same concept, bicycling and walking. So doing that last mile through a bike or walking is something that's being pushed as a federal policy and as a regional policy as well. So that's another angle.
Just a quick comment. I ride our service a lot, and it's amazing how many bikes one sees on our trains and on our buses. This place is changing, and the fact of the matter is, my comments about fares applying again to this issue, but there's a lot of bikes out there. We do have an issue with state law, which is troubling. We'd like to have bike racks on the front of buses that would accept 3 bicycles. But by state law, if we do that, we have to have a committee with the unions that would approve schedules, that is, basically control the budget of the agency, and all votes of the committee would have to be unanimous. Well, we can't agree to that. Right now, we have bike racks that have 2 bikes on them. If we are ever successful in Sacramento, we'll go up to 3 bikes, but I'm not optimistic.
So, one of the causes for a lot of slowdowns in a lot of construction projects has to relate to utility relocation. This seems to be a constant comment as we move through these projects. What can be done to improve that initial coordination?
Well, from the engineering side, getting those as-builts and using the services that identify utilities in advance so we can design them into our plans. We're working with the City of Charlotte on their Blue Line extension. We're doing the CM, and we use their local services, which is, here you say, don't dig, call this number just in case you're digging into a utility. Well, they provided us with all the locations of all utilities along this corridor. Turns out a lot of them were off by 50 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet. And so we've had to have all kinds of, in-the-field changes for utility relocation. That increases the cost, and that's one of the major cost drivers in a project.
Okay. Great. We have a couple minutes left. One of the things we were talking about was technology, and we also have a new mayor here in Los Angeles who believes strongly in adopting technology. But one of the things that I've noticed for the city of Los Angeles is a lack of connectivity at most of the underground rail stations or Wi-Fi available on the rail as well. So how do we add technology back into our system?
When I arrived at Metro, coming up 5 years ago, we talked about Wi-Fi in the subway in particular, and we were hesitant to do it because of the train bombings in Spain. About 2 years ago, I think we flipped on the issue. We're in the process now of seeking a supplier that would enable us to have Wi-Fi in the subway. I think on net, we've concluded that there's a net safety benefit by having the people down there have communications. If somebody wants to do something bad with a train, they don't need to have a cell phone to do it.
Any other last questions? All right, well, if not, I'm going to say that's the time we have for this panel. I'd like to again thank our panel sponsors, Metro, as well as Englander, Knabe and Allen, and our track sponsor, Clear Channel Outdoor and Southwest Airlines. Let's also give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you. One last note, housekeeping. Please be sure to fill out your exit survey the VICA staff has provided and hand it to the staff or an ambassador at the back of the room, or you can turn it into the registration table. The next panels will begin at 11 a.m., so in the meantime, I encourage all of you to visit our exhibitors and make sure to return your bingo card to the VICA registration table for your chance to win one of 2 round-trip airline tickets to anywhere Southwest Airlines flies, an Americana at Brand gift basket worth $3,000, or 2 tickets to the Amundsen Theater and one of 2 Fitbit bits. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.
Please fill out your surveys in the orange paper.